Welcome back. So, hey, Richard, it's good to see you.
Nice to see you. It's good to be seen.
It is. It feels like it's been a very long week. In part, that's because I know it's because schools are just starting back, and so we're getting through the second week here, and my goodness, it just makes everything is so different. Everything is so up in the air, with the Delta variant and all this kind of stuff. I mean, we're not talking about COVID today, but it has affected just about everything in our lives.
It's hard not to talk about COVID because it's such an overwhelming news story. Everybody's talking about it. And it's really difficult because you think, well, should we discuss it? And you just have to, I guess, stop talking about it after a while. I mean, there are other things happening around the world, goodness knows. And I think, Bernie, don't you get that feeling that we have probably reached some kind of an endpoint on, there are just some people who are not going to get vaccinated.
Right.
There are some people who don't believe in masks, and there really isn't anything that we're going to do about that. I mean, the lines have been drawn, and I think that early on in the pandemic, they predicted that 30% of people would not get vaccinated, no matter what, and that's just about where we are. And I don't think any evidence is going to convince them of that. I mean, people are dying. People who didn't get vaccinated are now telling people, please get vaccinated. I'm sorry that I didn't get the vaccine. I don't think it's going to matter.
Yeah, no, it's discouraging and it's challenging because it does affect everyone.
Yeah.
So yeah. So again, dealing with all of that, and of course with school starting back, you're dealing with that, and in the midst of hundreds, if not thousands, of students in a building that you're in, and trying to cope with all of that. So it's made for a couple of really long weeks, but again, our goal isn't to talk about COVID today. We're going to talk about some relationship issues. Now, a lot of what we do in our practice is work with. We certainly work with a lot of individuals. We also work with a lot of couples, and much of the work that we do, whether it's with individuals or with couples, is focused on couples. We focus on dealing with helping people manage relationships. And so we're going to talk about relationships and attachment today.
Right. That's right. When we talk to couples, much of what we discuss is how do you communicate effectively with each other? And by effectively, we mean in ways that doesn't create problems in the relationship, okay? Not just do you understand, but communicate in a way that it's clear and doesn't create additional problems. And the second thing is, how do you resolve your differences? And those seem to be the two things that we focus on. Now, there are many factors involved in communication, effective communication, and resolving our differences. But one of them is your attachment style. I think most people have heard of the 5 love languages.
Right.
It's a common thing out there. And that your love language can affect your relationship. Well, I believe that attachment can also influence your relationship in the same kind of way. Attachment's a little less familiar to us. Love languages is easy to understand and say, oh yeah, that's who I am. Attachment theory is a little bit more complicated than that, but it exerts the same kind of an influence.
Right. Well, and I think that part of that is because when we think of attachment, we typically think of kids. We think
exactly
the attachment between a child toward their parent, but we have attachments to other people as well. And and I think that you brought up a good point that when we talk about communication and as we go through some of these issues with attachment, we think about resolving differences and solving conflicts and stuff in a relationship. I think it's important to know that all relationships have disagreements, all relationships have conflict, and some of the biggest researchers in relationships, like the Gottmans and all, they talk about, you know, a relationship is healthy when there's conflict, when there's some disagreement, because that means that you're comfortable enough to state your opinion, and the other person's comfortable enough to state their opinion. And again, as we talk about attachment, we're going to talk about some of those kinds of factors, but there is no conflict-free relationship. There's bound to be conflict at some point in so but when we think about attachment, you know, again, much of that early research was as it relates to kids, and it has to do with the development and the, you know, the formation of this comfort level that we have with each other, that our needs and our wants, all that stuff is going to be met, that we're going to be attended to and comforted when we need it.
And as you say, all of this begins in childhood.
Right.
I mean, it's much of the literature, much of the research has been done in childhood, because that's when attachment first occurs.
Right.
It's the infant caregiver attachment, and the understanding of attachment comes out of psychoanalytic theory by Freud, who said Freud is sort of the first child psychologist in a way, because he was the first to say there's some special relationship that begins during infancy, and continues.
Well, because what he did was he was working with adults, mostly adult women, married women, and what he would talk about was, you know, some of these issues that you're experiencing as an adult are rooted in things that happened as you were a child, when you were a child.
That's
and
right.
So, and it makes really good sense, and we continue to see this even outside of the psychoanalytic field branch, that, you know, depending on the strength and the quality of your attachment in childhood, that helps predict in many ways the level and quality of your attachments as an adult. You know, kids who don't ever form a really secure attachment to a parent have a really difficult time forming attachments to others as they get older, including romantic relationships as they become adults.
That's right. Now, so we trace it back to Freud, but the father of attachment is John Bowlby. That's the name that comes up over and over again. Okay, and he was the one who first started to put together sort of a theory, a comprehensive understanding of attachment. But he came out of that psychoanalytic tradition, Freud, and so he said that early experiences of childhood influence your development and behavior later in life. So he took Freud's idea and developed it, and he believed that attachment was evolutionary, that parents take care of young children as an instinctive drive for survival. Okay, and this is so it's an instinctive drive, something that's built into our DNA. Okay, and there are several basic propositions of attachment.
Right.
One is that you get confidence, you develop a confidence that your primary caregiver will be available, will take care of your needs. As an infant, you can't take care of your own needs. So you get a nurturing caregiver, takes care of your needs, and so you develop less fear. There's less distress and less fear, because somebody out there is taking care of me. Okay. Second, confidence develops during what he calls a critical period. Now, a critical period, that phrase is important, because when we use the term critical period, what it means is that if it doesn't develop at this time, it may not develop.
Right, and we see that very often in various cases from around the world, especially as it relates to like foster situations and orphanages from around the world, where, you know, you have children who, as you know, newborns or very young infants, are placed in some of these orphanages where they're not tended to, that their needs aren't met. You know, that first level of confidence isn't reached, and as a result, you know, they often have lifelong challenges with developing that ability to trust and to have that confidence that their needs are going to be met, because it didn't happen early in life. And many times, no matter how loving, how, you know, secure, how you know, consistent a future parent is, or a future caregiver is, that child may never develop that ability to have that full attachment, that full confidence.
That's right. And when we use the word confidence, we could also use the word security.
Right.
There's a security in knowing that somebody's taking care of you. And you can imagine what it does to an infant who's not cared for, who's cold and wet and hungry and thirsty and tired, and those needs are not being met. So we could replace confidence with security. And then the last proposition is that the attachment that you have as an infant or young child influences your behavior later on. It may not be identical in adulthood. And that's an important point, is that it doesn't mean just because you have this kind of attachment as an infant, you're going to have exactly the same attachment as an adult. But the kind of attachment you have will influence your behavior, your expectations, and your responses to other people later in life.
Absolutely. And so it's not one-to-one predictable. It's not causal for using this research statistical words,
Right.
but it is correlated. When we see a person, and it's oftentimes sort of reverse correlated. So when you see an adult who has a really difficult time forming relationships and managing some of those details and conflicts in relationships, you look back and you can see that they had some of those really difficult times as a child. And so there is this relationship there between childhood and adulthood.
Right. Yeah. It's not deterministic, but it does influence. Right.
Right.
Now, if John Bowlby is the father of attachment theory, Mary Ainsworth is the mother.
Right.
Okay? Because it was Mary Ainsworth. She did that research where she would put parents and children in a room, and then she would ask the parent to leave.
Right.
Until the baby got just started to cry and fuss a little bit. And then the parent would be reintroduced to the child. And then she would observe those interactions. And in observing those interactions, she came up with 3 types of attachment.
Right.
One, secure, ambivalent, and avoidant. Now, the secure attachment is the first one. The second 2, ambivalent and avoidant, were signs of insecure attachment. Now, since then, there has been a 4th type, and that is called disorganized. And as you can imagine, the disorganized, of course, would be the worst. Okay, but Mary Ainsworth was the first to come up with these first 3, and that's what we're going to discuss here. Secure attachment as a young child, and then what does it look like in adulthood? So it looks like this, and then it looks like this in adulthood.
Right. Absolutely. And it's interesting because we often talk about 80%, right? And we talk about, 80% of the population, 80% of children are going to learn, well in the regular classroom. 80% of people tend to be generally have good mental health status and everything. Well, according to their research, about 80% of attachments are secure.
Right.
For the most part, most people develop a secure attachment to their parents during those early years of life.
Right, which makes sense because otherwise everybody would be dysregulated. There would be hundreds of it, and there aren't that many. So most of us take care of our babies.
Right.
Most parents, and we can talk about oxytocin and survival and but most parents really do a pretty good job of taking care of infants. Right. When they get to 2 and 3, it becomes a bit more of a challenge. Right. But most of us take care of infants. Okay. And so most kids end up securely attached.
Right. And when a child has a good secure attachment, they tend to have fewer behavioral problems. They tend to be less aggressive. They mature at a rate consistent with what we would expect kids to mature. And so, as they progress through childhood and into adulthood, again, they tend to be more trusting. They tend to have pretty good self-esteem. You can imagine if you grow up and that your needs are going to be met, and that when you're discomfort or you're experiencing discomfort, somebody's going to come and help comfort you. They're going to make you feel important, and so you end up having better self-esteem. you tend to be more sharing of your feelings and with other people. And so these early experiences have these long-term effects that are, important when we're thinking about different types of relationships as adults.
Right. Yeah. So in secure attachment, as children, what we see in children, and as we mention each one of these things, you can immediately think about it as, oh, so as an adult, it would look like this. Okay. So a child who's securely attached is mildly distressed when they're separated from their parents. Well, parents are sending their kids off to college at this time of year, and they're mildly distressed about that separation. Okay. Second, securely attached children will seek and accept comfort from parents. That they're held and they're nestled and they respond to that, the comforting of the parent.
Mm-hmm.
And they greet their parents when the parents approach. They greet their parents with positive emotions. There's this obvious positive connection,
Mm-hmm.
and there's an obvious preference for parents to strangers. All right, so these are the things, and you can see how this would play itself out in
Right.
adult relationships.
And these kids, they recover so quickly.
Mhm.
You see, if you go into YouTube and you type in attachment and the strange situation, you'll see lots of videos of these types of experiments, and you can see that the securely attached kid does all of these things. They smile and they go to their parents when their parent walks back in the room, and they seek that comfort, but then they're ready to get back down and play again.
Right.
It's
That's right.
they feel comforted. They're like, oh yeah, I knew she would come back. That's right.
Mhm.
And then they go down and they can play again.
Right.
As we get into some of the other ones, we don't see that.
Right.
We don't see that same quick recovery. We see more of that dysregulation that we often talk
Mhm.
about.
That's right. Right. So you can see that if you're securely attached as a child, as an adult, you tend to have more trusting relationships. You have higher self-esteem. You're less likely to get taken advantage of or be in an abusive relationship. You're willing to share your feelings with your partner and with other people. And you seek out social supports. You understand the value of social supports. And so you just are living in this healthier sort of supportive environment, okay, which is what you experienced as a child. And once we leave the secure attachment, we get into what Ainsworth called ambivalent attachment.
Right.
And these kids are more wary of strangers. These are the kids who have a little stranger anxiety. They're fussy when parent passes the child off to another person. The kid sort of starts to rebel and resist a little bit. There's far more distress when their parents leave. There's a little separation anxiety. And they don't, when the parent returns, the child isn't as comforted by the parent. They don't settle in and nestle in and start to relax. They remain a little distressed, even when the parent tries to comfort them.
Right. Yeah. They cry for longer periods of time, and and then it takes a lot longer for the child to be able to get back to exploring the room. And many times you'll see this even before the parent leaves, where the
Right.
child tends to stay much closer to the parent. And we see this with
Right.
all of the insecure types. The child tends to stay a little bit closer to the parent, or frequently checks to make sure that the parent is still there,
Right.
even before the parent leaves.
Right.
So yeah, they have this great difficulty regulating that separation.
Right. And so then as adults, as the ambivalent attachment, when it reaches adulthood, you feel this reluctance to become too close to other people. You don't share your feelings. And when the relationship ends, it's like the end of the world, okay, because you've attached yourself to somebody, but when it ends, then you're left to sort of wander. As adults, you're reluctant to get too close to other people, and you're always concerned that your partner doesn't really love you. you know, that there's this lack of trust that this person doesn't really care about me because you weren't attached securely during infancy and early childhood. And this lack of trust, this lack of reciprocal relationship leads to a lot of breakups.
Right.
Because the relationship begins to feel cold and distant. And I think we see this in marriages all the time, where people get together and we talk about the 7-year itch, or after 5 years, the problems begin, because that's when these things, over time, you just don't feel that the other person cares about you. And so, and over a few years, it builds and builds and builds until the relationship feels like it's cold and distant.
Right. And what often happens is that, as you said, you know, when the relationship ends, the person becomes very distressed. And
Right.
when it was if it was a marriage or a relationship that had children, that person tends to then sort of cling to the kids, the young kids, as that source of security. Well, you know, my partner didn't love me that much, but look, you know, the kids need me. And it almost creates, you know, if we kind of introducing a new vocabulary word, codependence with, you know, others, including your children, where it's like you need them to need you, and you have that relationship to fill that need for that love and that attachment.
Right. But and so the relationship that you weren't able to have with an adult, you are able to have with your children, because children bring a different level of love and attachment. You know,
Because they need you.
they are dependent on you.
Right. And it only lasts until the kids get old enough to move on, and, you know, they start working and wanting to spend more time with their friends.
Right.
When that parent experiences that separation, or that break again.
Right.
And it's really difficult for them to let
Right.
go.
The kids they become teenagers and they leave, which is what teenagers are supposed to do. And that leaves that vacuum in the adult caregiver's life. Then the third is avoidant attachment. This is where kids start to really either avoid or resist. Sometimes resistance is passive, sometimes it's active. And these are kids who tend to be a little bit more aggressive, and where we enter the field of reactive attachment disorder, where kids actually become pretty physically aggressive with not only with their parents, but with other other individuals.
Right. So what you see is that these kids may actively avoid their parents, and they don't really seek that contact and comfort. You know, if they're distressed, they don't want to be held. They don't want the parent to pick them up. And so, you know, in this strange situation, the parent walks in and the child's upset. The parent goes to pick up the kid, and the kid pushes them away, or hits them, or sort of refuses them in some way. And you know, it's distressing to both the parent and the child, because, you know, what parent wants their child to respond to them that way? Though it's usually, again, a sort of a result of this inadequate development of an attachment and that security.
That's right. And then, so you can imagine these children, they become adults, they weren't attached as infants. And these are the kids who arch their backs and they headbutt, and it almost looks like they're trying to escape from their parents, right? Rather than be comforted by them. As adults, these are they're more likely to become individuals who have problems with intimacy. They don't invest much emotion in social and romantic relationships. They're unable to share their true thoughts and feelings. They always remain a little bit distant, you know, like they're just afraid to get too close. Okay, so they avoid intimacy by using excuses. I have a headache. I have this. I have to go to work. And you see this in many relationships where one or the other partners is just too busy to have a relationship, to invest in the relationship.
Right.
Okay.
And so that you see that in lots of aspects of the relationship, from time they spend together to their intimacy, and there isn't as much of a a level of commitment to one person, so they may end up having other relationships as well. And and you especially see it during times of stress.
Yeah, right. Right.
When there's we all go through these different life struggles, whether it's financial or moves or whatever the case may be. And these individuals have a really difficult time connecting with their partners at those times, so that they can work together to solve the issues or to come up with solutions. And they just continue to have those difficulty sharing emotions and feelings with them.
Right. That's why these settling marital differences is so difficult with people who can't share their real feelings.
Right.
Okay. One other thing I don't think I need a trigger warning here, but one of the problems that we encounter with couples is we talk about intimate relationships outside the marriage. Okay. And in a healthy marriage, healthy relationship, that's far less likely. But this does happen. And it may be that the partner who is unable to attach, who has avoidant attachment, is the kind of partner who will go out and have casual sex, even if they're in a committed relationship. And the problem is not that they don't love their partner, it's that they just can't make enough of a commitment to keep the relationship confined to the home. Okay. And because they can't attach enough. And so it's a little bit easier for them to go out and do other things with other people. Okay.
Right.
And so again, we say infidelity, but it could be an attachment problem. And if if the therapist approaches it as an attachment issue rather than just a simple infidelity issue, a bad choice or bad judgment, then there's some work you could do therapeutically with the attachment.
Right. Right.
And so other common characteristics, they don't support their partners during stressful times. I think of Newt Gingrich bringing divorce papers to his wife while she's in the hospital getting treatment for cancer, and he brings in the divorce papers. That's sort of the opposite of supporting your partner during times of stress. But we often see that. We often hear that. Parents say, I'm going through this very stressful time and my husband just isn't available. Or the husband will say, I get home and I'm tired and my wife just doesn't understand how much stress I'm under. Okay. So there's this, the inability to support your partner during stressful times, and especially the inability to share feelings and thoughts and emotions. People will go to a therapist and they will disclose their real feelings here, but they can't disclose those feelings at home.
Right.
And that's a problem. That's an attachment problem.
Right. Yeah. And so as we think about couples and attachment styles and a lot of these things that we're talking about, there are many factors that play into it, not just attachment style. Brene Brown, for example, talks a lot about vulnerability and the willingness to be vulnerable with our partners, to open up and talk about emotions and feelings and things like that. And so all of that plays into this. But there's another article that we linked to in the show notes called "Couples and Attachment Differences,"
right.
And in it, the author talks about the reality that all attachment doesn't look the same. We have these three categories for the most part, for if you include the newer ones of, but all of attachment styles don't have to look exactly alike. You can have a couple who, the way that they manifest their attachments could be a little bit different.
Right.
But all of these attachments do influence the relationships. They don't have to look the same, but they do influence the relationship.
Right. Even an intact, healthy relationship is still affected by each person's attachment.
Right.
Right. And where it becomes problematic is because you could have one person in the relationship has a secure attachment, another has an avoidant attachment. But as long as you're working together, you can still overcome those differences. It
Right.
doesn't mean that a secure has to marry a secure.
Right.
Where you get into trouble is if avoidant marries avoidant, and that could be a problem.
Well, and it's a problem. Like one of the things that we've talked about often on the podcast, and especially before COVID, when we were talking about lots of other things,
Yeah, right.
one of the things we talked about a lot was, just insight.
Mhm.
If you don't have a very good attachment style, like if it's really difficult for you to trust and to connect with other people, the more that you recognize it and can communicate, look, I love you, but I really have a difficult time connecting. I have a difficult time communicating. I'm going to do my best, but let's work with a therapist. Let's meet with somebody on a regular basis so that I
Right.
can keep working on this. And whether I keep getting better at it or not, at least we're meeting somewhere where we feel comfortable and we can share some of these things, and be open with each other.
Right.
That can be such a valuable approach to dealing with some of these issues, to where a person who has a secure attachment can have a successful relationship with somebody who has an avoidant or a more complicated insecure attachment.
Right.
They could still work things out, but they have to be able to be open and acknowledge where they are.
That's right. Right. And you have to at least be willing to investigate what was your likely attachment to your parents. I mean, I always assumed that I had a secure attachment, but as I dig into attachment there, I'm not really sure.
Right.
Was I really securely attached? Because we all have some of these other characteristics, and probably what people are going to find is that in some ways I'm securely attached, and in some ways I'm avoidant or ambivalently attached. Okay, and so you could have some combination, I think it really would help couples, and I can think of couples I work with, I have worked with, that their problem was probably attachment.
Mhm.
That one or the other partners just wasn't able to bring enough enough passion, emotion, commitment to the relationship, not because of the other person, not because they weren't happy in the marriage, but because of early attachment issues.
Yeah. And again, I think that the challenge is that, or where it really begins to deteriorate and fail, is when one or both of the partners just don't recognize and take accountability for their part of
Mhm.
it.
Right.
Say,
Right.
this is where my difficulty is, and I'm going to do this about it, or
That's right.
and this is what I'm willing to do.
Right.
You can say, well, I have a difficult time, trusting. You're just going to have to deal with that.
Mhm.
That's not working as a partnership. That's
No.
not working to improve or strengthen the relationship. That's just saying, I have this problem. You're just, and that's just it.
Right.
There's nothing I can do about it.
That's right. And as you say, it gives you a focus for bringing change to the relationship. Instead of saying my partner doesn't love me, my partner doesn't care about me, my partner is selfish, because that's typically what people say when they begin therapy. You can say, well, no, wait a minute, I understand, because my partner has told me about his or her early life experiences, and this could well be an attachment problem,
Right.
which gives you, it completely changes the focus, and it gives you a place to do the work that you have to do. It's like we said at the beginning, it's like the 5 love languages. It gives you a vocabulary and a context in which you can do the work that you need to do to improve the relationship.
Right.
Okay.
So when we think about these attachment
Mhm.
styles, we can think about how they influenced sort of
Right.
massive
Mhm.
components of a healthy relationship. And
Right.
one of those massive components of a relationship is communication.
Right.
Um, you know, and I think that those are the examples that we're using here, right? Is that, the ability and willingness to openly communicate with one another and say, this
Mhm.
is where I am, this is who I am, this is my history, what is your history, and listening to the other person, so that you have this exchange of information,
Mhm.
so that you can understand where the other person is, where they come from, and how your aspects, your characteristics mesh with that or don't mesh with that, how that works.
Right, because when we talk about communication, we're talking about how you hear, whether you hear, but also how you hear what the other person is saying to you.
Right.
And we all know couples who, one of the persons will say something and it's taken completely out of context. It's completely misinterpreted. That's not what I meant. That's not, you're not hearing me correct. This is what we hear in therapy. So are we reading? Are we not reading, not hearing? Are we overhearing? Are we reading too much into it? And those kinds of communication problems, you could probably trace back to attachment.
Right.
If I'm insecure and somebody says, wow, that's not a very good color on you, that could be devastating to me. Okay. Not what the person meant. That's how I took it because of my attachment. And what would I do? I would probably become offended and hurt and counterattack. Okay. And if you think about how many times we're communicating with each other in a partner to partner, how about parent to teenager? Imagine the insecurities there,
Right.
If you have an attachment problem, or employer to employee. Your employer comes in and criticizes you. It's not meant as a personal attack. It's just that this was done incorrectly. And well, if you have an ambivalent or avoidant, you're probably going to react inappropriately or incorrectly.
Right.
But so first of all, attachment is a way, it gives you an avenue to improve communication. If you think about communication as a function of attachment.
Right. And
problem solving.
Right. And when you think about communication, it flows almost directly into that second pillar of problem solving. If when there are issues or challenges in a relationship, which there are issues and challenges in every
relationship, right?
You have to be able to communicate to problem solve through that issue. Because when we can't communicate, when we can't problem solve, issues are never addressed properly.
They're never resolved, right?
Well, and I brought up the Gottmans earlier, and I'm going to bring them up again in a few minutes.
Right.
We'll get to the third pillar, but what they talked about is through their research, and they have researched tens of thousands of couples. What they said is the success of a marriage isn't dependent upon your ability to resolve a conflict. He said many times conflicts are not resolved, even in really healthy relationships.
Right.
But they can communicate about them, and they can problem solve, and they can come to a compromise in an agreement, and that's part of problem solving.
Right.
It can be, I really don't like your work hours, and you may say, I can't change my work hours. But what it sounds like is you're saying that it doesn't feel like I spend enough time with you and with the family, and so. Instead of, because I don't have any control over this, we can compromise and we can do this.
Exactly.
We're not going to resolve that conflict, solve that problem specifically, but we can resolve the real problem.
That's right. That's right. One of the first questions I ask couples is, how do you resolve your differences? What is the process that you use to resolve your differences? And most of the time I get, we don't have one of those. And what the next thing they say is, we just argue until we're exhausted, and then we go to bed. We have, but we don't resolve the issue. Right. So the issue keeps cycling through their relationship. Right. And what happens with couples is that in the absence of a problem-solving procedure, you tend to get into, I call it the kitchen sink argument, where you just escalate and escalate and escalate until you're throwing everything but the kitchen sink at each other. Okay. And well, you did this. Yeah, but 2 years ago, remember we were at that party and you did, yeah, but when I did that, remember the reason I did. And it goes on and on and on and on and on. And you argue to exhaustion. You don't resolve the issue. You're able to be together again, but then a short time later, the problem comes up because you never resolved it.
Right. And it's the difference between arguing and discussing or arguing and problem solving.
No problem solving, right.
Those are two very different things, because if you're arguing, it's like you're both trying to convince the other of that your point is correct.
That you're correct, right.
If you're problem solving, you're trying to come to a solution. And so that perspective, you can always tell by someone's vocabulary, even,
Right.
if they say, well, we argue about things all the time. Okay, you're not working to solve the problem. You're trying to prove your point or trying to convince the other person to agree with you.
Right.
You're not trying to solve the problem. And so, but again, in many ways, that goes back to your communication style. But it's your ability to problem solve it. But and then all of that culminates in that third pillar. And the Gottmans again refer to this as, this is the secret. This is the secret key to a healthy relationship, and that is trust. You have to be able to trust your partner, that they're going to be, it's the same thing that we talked about with kids, that they're going to meet your needs, that they're going to listen to you, that they're going to be available to you, that they're going to have your best interest in mind, just as they have their own best interest in mind. But trust is a massive aspect of a healthy relationship.
And I think they're correct. They put this as the foundation, but trust is directly related to attachment.
Right.
Because if you have poor attachment as an infant, you're likely to have poor attachment as an adult. Right. If you couldn't, remember we used the word security when we were talking about infant attachment, and that same security as an adult, we would translate it to trust. I'm secure in my relationship with you. I trust you to have my best interests at heart. And I see couple after couple after couple, and one or the other will say, he just doesn't, I don't think he cares about it. I don't think he trusts me. I don't think he cares about me. I don't think that's the issue. The issue is that a insecure attachment can lead to these trust issues, which then affect everything else.
Right. And people will come in and say from the very beginning, I have trust issues. I don't, and that's great. That's great insight. But it's like so many other things where it's fantastic to recognize that about yourself. Right. But what are you going to do about it?
And, I liken it to trust is a symptom of an underlying problem. The problem may be attachment. Right. Okay.
So we need to be willing to do something to help you resolve this issue with trust.
That's right.
And that's oftentimes a therapeutic process.
Right. That's right. Yeah. Trust, a lack of trust, unable to solve problems, communication problems. That's the tip of the iceberg. Okay. That tells us that there's something fundamentally wrong here. And so let's take a closer look at this. And as you look at it, you can look at love languages, but you also look at attachment. There are other issues, but attachment is one of the things that I think many of us overlook. Right. We overlook it individually, we overlook it therapeutically too, that this could be an attachment issue. And we need to remember to investigate that.
Definitely, because the more that we understand our attachment, the better we will be at improving and addressing issues in our relationship. So, looking at how well or poorly you communicate, look at how you approach solving problems with your partner and resolving some of those differences. Is it just arguing, or are you really looking for a solution? And then looking at trust, like you said, trust is the foundation. I think the first word that we used was confidence, and what is confidence but trust?
Right. That's right.
And so when we can feel confident, when we have that trust in our partner, it significantly changes the way in which we're going to communicate and problem solve and believe that they have that they're looking out for us just as we're looking out for them.
Exactly. Yep. And this is something you have partner to partner, but it's also parent to child.
Right. It's in every relationship.
Same thing applies. How do you resolve your differences with your children?
Yeah.
That also is an attachment issue.
Definitely. Yeah. It's a part of every relationship that you have. So,
right.
All right. Well, I think that's it for today then. Yeah. Until next time.
We may talk about attachments again. There are a couple of other attachment issues that we may want to discuss in the future.
I think so.
So yeah, we'll talk about that.
Definitely.
Okay.
All right. Well, until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid.